My name is Emma, I am 37 years old, and I am currently standing in the absolute center of a breathtaking sun-drenched foyer of a $20 million estate, staring up at a massive family portrait that is making the blood in my veins run completely cold. The distinguished man in the painting is Richard, a 45-year-old tech billionaire who just officially hired my elite estate management company less than an hour ago. But it is the beautiful woman standing right next to him that is making my hands shake uncontrollably. It is my older sister, Chloe. She is the exact same sister who committed a massive corporate theft 15 years ago, the very same sister who fell to her hands and knees begging me to take the fall because she had a baby on the way, and the exact same sister who completely abandoned me the second the judge sentenced me to 3 miserable years in a federal prison. I sacrificed my entire future for her, only for her to completely erase me and marry into staggering wealth. I was pulled from my overwhelming shock by heavy footsteps echoing behind me. Richard was walking into the room, asking me if everything was all right before the massive front oak door swung open, and Chloe herself walked in, freezing instantly as her panicked eyes locked directly onto mine.
To truly make you understand the crushing gravity of that specific moment in the foyer, I need to take you back exactly 15 years, to an incredibly dark time when my entire world revolved around desperately trying to keep my broken family together. We lived in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the bleak outskirts of Chicago, just me and Chloe, who was 24 years old at the time and the absolute center of my universe. Our parents had tragically passed away in a terrible car accident when we were teenagers, leaving us with absolutely nothing but a massive pile of medical debt and a desperate need to survive. I completely idolized Chloe. She was the highly charismatic older sister who always seemed to know exactly what to do and how to confidently handle every single crisis that life threw at us. We both worked as lowly administrative assistants at a mid-sized corporate logistics firm, barely making enough minimum wage to keep the flickering lights on and put cheap groceries in our tiny refrigerator.
I was perfectly content with our simple, difficult life, genuinely believing that as long as we had each other's backs, we could successfully weather any terrible storm. But Chloe always desperately wanted more. She hated our cheap clothes. She despised taking the crowded public bus in the freezing rain. And she looked at the wealthy executives in our corporate office with a toxic mixture of burning envy and bitter resentment. She wanted the luxury bags, the expensive vacations, and the undeniable power that came with having endless amounts of money. I never truly realized how deep and dangerous that dark resentment ran until the freezing cold Tuesday morning when I walked into our tiny, dark kitchen and found her sitting on the cracked linoleum floor. She was violently hyperventilating, her face pale as a ghost, completely surrounded by dozens of printed official bank statements that absolutely did not belong to us, desperately clutching a calculator. My heart instantly dropped right into the bottom of my stomach as I rushed over and knelt down beside her trembling body, desperately asking her what in the world was going on and why she was crying so hysterically. Between violent, choking sobs and desperate gasps for thin air, Chloe finally confessed the horrific, life-destroying truth. She admitted that she had been systematically siphoning large amounts of money from the company's main operating accounts for over 6 agonizing months. She had maliciously stolen Mo's $60,000, carefully funneling every single cent into a secret, untraceable offshore account, merely to pay off massive hidden credit card debts. She had secretly accumulated these massive debts to buy expensive designer bags, luxury shoes, and completely fake a wealthy lifestyle she could never realistically afford. An unexpected internal financial audit was officially scheduled for the very end of the week, and there was absolutely no possible way to hide the glaring missing funds from the ruthless corporate accountants. She was inevitably going to be exposed, publicly arrested, and sent away to a federal prison for a very long time. But the specific, devastating detail that completely shattered my entire world into a million pieces was when she slowly looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and desperately pleading. She told me that she was exactly 3 months pregnant. The father was a wealthy, married executive at our firm who had already cruelly abandoned her the second he found out. She aggressively grabbed my hands, her sharp acrylic nails sticking painfully deep into my skin, and begged me to miraculously save her life. She sobbed uncontrollably, swearing that an innocent baby could absolutely not be born inside a dark prison cell, that her entire life would be permanently destroyed. Because I was the one who officially handled the specific client accounts where the money was illegally taken from, it would be incredibly easy for me to just falsely confess and say I did it. She promised to hire a great lawyer and fix everything. I can still vividly remember the incredibly heavy, suffocating silence in that tiny kitchen as her desperate, manipulative words hung in the stale air like a thick fog. A million terrified, chaotic thoughts aggressively raced through my young mind, but the absolute overriding emotion was a desperate, blinding, unconditional love for my older sister and the innocent, unborn child she was currently carrying. I was an incredibly naive, deeply foolish 22-year-old girl who genuinely believed that family was the absolute only thing that truly mattered in this cold, cruel world. I looked closely at her tear-stained, pathetic face, her violently trembling hands resting softly on her slightly swollen stomach, and I made the absolute worst, most destructive decision of my entire existence. I foolishly, blindly agreed to take the full blame for her terrible crimes. I hugged her tightly, promising her that I would protect her and the baby, completely unaware that I was happily signing my own permanent death warrant. The next few agonizing weeks were a relentless, terrifying, chaotic blur of aggressive police interrogations in tiny windowless rooms, cold steel handcuffs cutting painfully deeply into my fragile wrists, and the incredibly cold, unyielding, brutal reality of the criminal justice system. Chloe absolutely did not hire a brilliant, expensive lawyer like she had tearfully promised. She conveniently claimed she could not afford one, and the exhausted, completely indifferent public defender I was eventually assigned simply told me to immediately plead guilty to secure a slightly lighter prison sentence. The stern, unforgiving judge did not care at all about my perfectly clean criminal record or my quiet, terrified demeanor in the massive courtroom. He wanted to make an aggressive example out of me. When he aggressively slammed his gavel and confidently handed down a devastating 3-year sentence in a brutal state penitentiary, I quickly turned around to look at the crowded public gallery, desperately searching for Chloe's familiar face. But the hard wooden benches were completely empty. The harsh, brutal reality of federal prison is absolutely something you can never truly comprehend until the incredibly heavy, solid steel doors slam completely shut behind you, loudly echoing with a terrifying finality that completely shatters your innocent soul. Those 3 agonizing years were a terrifying daily battle for basic survival, an endless, suffocating nightmare of gray concrete walls, completely tasteless, stale food, and a constant, underlying, terrifying hum of physical violence and deep emotional despair. I spent my long, freezing nights desperately staring up at the horribly stained ceiling of my tiny claustrophobic cell, crying silently and uncontrollably into an incredibly thin, scratchy pillow. I held desperately onto the comforting thought of my beautiful sister and my sweet niece or nephew growing up safely on the outside. I constantly wrote Chloe long, emotional letters every single week, desperately pouring out my deep fear, my crushing loneliness, and my desperate need to just hear her voice in the darkness. Every single letter I painstakingly wrote was coldly returned to sender, harshly marked with a bright red stamp as completely undeliverable. She had quietly moved away. She had completely changed her personal phone number. She had completely and utterly erased me from her entire existence, the exact moment I foolishly took the fall for her selfish sins. The devastating realization did not hit me all at once. It was a slow, agonizing, toxic poison that quietly seeped into my veins day after miserable day. The sister I loved so fiercely and unconditionally had deliberately used me as a convenient human shield and carelessly discarded me into the trash like a piece of garbage. The unbearable, agonizing pain of that ultimate betrayal was infinitely worse than the physical confinement of the prison walls. It completely hardened my broken heart, permanently turning my naive, foolish love into a cold, heavy stone of pure survival. I realized that the baby was probably just another disgusting lie used to manipulate my naive heart. When I was finally officially released on a freezing, miserable November morning, I walked out of those heavily guarded prison gates with absolutely nothing to my name. I had no money, no family, no safe place to go, and a devastating felony record permanently attached to my identity.
I spent the first few terrifying months living in a crowded, highly dangerous halfway house, working the exhausting night shift washing endless piles of dirty dishes at a grimy, disgusting local diner, where the foul smell of stale, burnt grease seemed to permanently seep into my pores. It was during this absolute depressing rock bottom that I finally met Sarah, a highly energetic, deeply compassionate 42-year-old woman who efficiently managed the chaotic diner kitchen. Sarah was incredibly tough, fiercely loud, and fiercely protective of her staff. She quickly noticed that I never talked, that I worked twice as hard as anyone else, and that I always looked like I was heavily carrying the entire weight of the world on my bruised shoulders. One late rainy night, after a particularly brutal, exhausting 14-hour shift, Sarah forcefully made me sit down at a sticky booth, poured me a massive cup of terrible, bitter diner coffee, and firmly demanded to know my tragic story. For the absolute first time in 3 agonizing years, the massive emotional dam finally broke into a million pieces. I completely broke down and told her absolutely everything. I violently sobbed until my chest physically ached and I could barely breathe, frantically spilling out the horrific betrayal, the stolen corporate money, the brutal prison time, and the crushing, suffocating loneliness that consumed me. Sarah absolutely did not judge me or look at me with pity. She just quickly reached across the sticky, dirty table, grabbed my trembling hand with a firm, comforting grip, and intensely told me that my life was absolutely not over. She sternly told me that I had to immediately stop bleeding for a toxic monster who was perfectly happy sitting back and watching me slowly die from a distance. Sarah instantly became my absolute lifeline and my fiercest protector in a world that had completely abandoned me. She kindly helped me find a cheap but incredibly clean studio apartment and bravely co-signed the strict lease when absolutely no one else would ever touch a convicted felon. She aggressively pushed me to start my own independent business, smartly arguing that no corporate office would ever willingly hire me with my permanent criminal record, so I had to aggressively create my own completely new opportunities. We ambitiously started an extremely small, humble residential cleaning service together. For 5 grueling, physically destructive years, my daily routine was an exhausting, relentless loop of brutal physical labor. I violently scrubbed disgusting toilets, obsessively polished hardwood floors on my painfully bruised hands and knees until my aching joints screamed in pure agony. I constantly breathed in harsh, toxic cleaning chemicals just to make enough meager money to survive and slowly build our small, struggling company from the absolute ground up. Every single hard-earned cent I desperately saved went right back into expanding the growing business. I smartly bought better, highly professional equipment, printed beautiful, glossy flyers, and slowly but surely transitioned from cleaning tiny, dirty apartments to managing massive, luxurious suburban homes. I aggressively poured all of my deep, unresolved anger and profound grief into my daily work, using my meticulous, obsessive attention to detail as a protective shield against the dark memories of the past. By the time I finally turned 37, I had successfully built a highly respected, incredibly lucrative elite estate management firm. That is exactly when the massive, life-changing call finally came in. A highly connected luxury real estate agent I frequently worked with urgently contacted me about a massive, unbelievable contract. A famous tech billionaire named Richard had just purchased a massive estate, and he desperately needed a top-tier management company. The incredibly lucrative contract was absolutely life-changing. It was the exact kind of massive money that would permanently secure my financial future and allow me to finally buy a beautiful, safe home of my very own. I spent weeks obsessively preparing the detailed proposal, organizing extensive background checks for my elite staff, and ensuring every single minute detail was absolutely undeniably perfect for the final presentation. When Richard's executive assistant finally called to officially tell me we had decisively won the highly competitive bid, I actually broke down and cried tears of pure joy. I frantically called Sarah immediately, my exhausted hands shaking with pure, unadulterated excitement, happily telling her that all the literal blood, painful sweat, and bitter tears had finally paid off beautifully. I had completely and successfully rebuilt my entire life from the devastating ashes, and I had done it all by myself. I had absolutely no idea that this massive personal triumph was about to walk me right back into my darkest nightmare.
Which brings me directly back to an incredibly suffocating, terrifying moment in the massive marble foyer of Richard's sprawling mansion, when Chloe suddenly walked through the heavy front door. The incredibly expensive designer shopping bags in her perfectly manicured hands dropped heavily to the hard marble floor with a deafening, echoing crash. All the healthy color instantly and completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. She looked exactly like she had just seen a terrifying, violent ghost. And in many ways, she absolutely had. Richard, standing proudly beside me, looked back and forth between us, completely and utterly oblivious to the massive nuclear bomb quietly sitting in his beautiful living room. He smiled warmly and enthusiastically introduced me. "Darling, this is Emma, the brilliant new estate manager I was telling you about. Emma, this is my wonderful, beautiful wife, Chloe." The sickening sound of her fake name spoken so lovingly by this innocent man made my stomach violently churn with absolute pure disgust. I forcefully managed a polite, incredibly tight smile, deliberately keeping my voice dangerously calm and professional. "It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you, ma'am," I said firmly, letting the formal, distant title hang heavily in the tense air, like a sharp, invisible threat. Chloe could barely even formulate a complete sentence. She nodded incredibly stiffly, her wide eyes absolutely filled with sheer, unadulterated panic, and quickly excused herself, desperately claiming she had a sudden, severe migraine. As soon as I quickly left the massive estate that afternoon, I frantically pulled my company car over to the side of the quiet road, opened the door, and violently threw up onto the grass. The overwhelming shock and visceral disgust were absolutely too much to physically process. I immediately called Sarah, my voice trembling so violently I could barely form the necessary words. I frantically told her everything that had just happened. Sarah was absolutely furious, her voice loud and protective. She aggressively demanded that I cancel the massive contract immediately, sternly warning me that a ruthless woman who would maliciously send her own sister to federal prison to selfishly save herself was dangerously capable of absolutely anything. She desperately told me to walk away and fiercely protect the beautiful peace I had fought so incredibly hard to build. But as I sat alone in my quiet car, a deep, primal, burning sense of absolute justice began to quickly replace my blinding panic. Why should I be the one to run away? I had honestly earned this incredible contract through years of honest, grueling work. I was not going to run. I was going to stay and force her to face her terrible demons. The very next morning, I confidently arrived at the massive estate at exactly 6 o'clock to begin officially organizing the household staff. I was standing in the massive gourmet kitchen, quietly reviewing complex inventory sheets, when the heavy wooden door forcefully swung open and Chloe aggressively marched in. She was wearing a luxurious silk robe, but the absolute panic in her eyes from yesterday had been completely replaced by an incredibly cold, desperate, violent hostility. She quickly locked the heavy door behind her and marched right up to me, aggressively invading my personal space. She wildly accused me of secretly tracking her down, of maliciously trying to blackmail her, and of jealously trying to ruin her perfect, wealthy life. She aggressively pulled an incredibly expensive checkbook out of her silk pocket, slammed it violently onto the massive marble island, and arrogantly told me she would write me a massive check for $100,000 right now if I completely tore up the lucrative contract and disappeared forever. The sheer, disgusting audacity of her pathetic offer made the blood in my veins absolutely boil with pure rage. I slowly leaned in incredibly close and coldly told her that exactly 15 years ago, she deliberately stole my precious freedom, my innocent youth, and my absolute trust in humanity, and that there was absolutely not enough filthy money in the entire world to ever make me disappear again. I firmly told her I was keeping the contract, I was going to do my exact job flawlessly, and if she ever tried to interfere with my company, I would march right into Richard's office and completely expose exactly who she really was. For the next exhausting month, working in that massive, beautiful house was an incredibly intense, silent psychological war. Chloe maliciously did everything in her absolute power to make my daily life completely miserable, constantly complaining and secretly sabotaging my staff's hard work. But I completely refused to break under her immense pressure. During this highly stressful time, as the official estate manager, part of my complex job was meticulously coordinating the massive household expenses. I quickly began to notice a very familiar, deeply disturbing, and highly illegal pattern in the paperwork. There were incredibly strange, massive invoices from mysterious shell companies for fake interior design consultations that absolutely never happened. Chloe was doing it all over again. She was aggressively stealing massive amounts of money from her own loving husband. I spent weeks secretly gathering the undeniable proof, perfectly cross-referencing fake vendor names and massive bank transfers until I had a flawless, undeniable case. I knew I desperately needed Richard to catch her completely in the act, to hear the devastating truth directly from her own lying mouth. I carefully waited for a quiet day when Richard was working closely in his massive home office, the heavy oak doors left slightly ajar. I boldly walked right into the adjacent library where Chloe was sitting, securely holding a heavy manila folder packed with absolute proof of her massive financial fraud. I loudly and professionally told her that I had found some massive, incredibly disturbing irregularities in the household budget. I calmly watched as she aggressively snatched the folder, her arrogant eyes quickly scanning the highlighted illegal bank transfers and the fake shell company registrations. The color completely drained from her shocked face. She violently jumped up, her face completely contorted with pure, unadulterated rage and absolute panic, and began to violently scream at me, aggressively calling me a pathetic, jealous loser who was obsessed with ruining her. She furiously screamed that Richard was a complete fool, that he had so much money he wouldn't even notice a few million missing, and that I was nothing but a dirty, convicted criminal whose word meant absolutely nothing against the perfect, loving wife of a billionaire. I don't think she will be the one going to jail this time, Chloe. A deep, devastatingly calm voice cut through the massive room. We both completely froze. Richard was standing right in the open doorway, his handsome face an unreadable, terrifying mask of absolute devastation and incredibly cold fury. He had quietly heard every single hateful, confessing word. Chloe's arrogant, aggressive posture instantly and completely collapsed. She violently fell to her trembling knees, sobbing hysterically, desperately crawling toward him and pathetically begging him to listen to her obvious lies. But Richard just looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. He carefully took the folder from the table, read the undeniable proof, and asked me if I was really her sister. I looked him dead in the eye and proudly said yes, confirming that she left me to rot in a cell 15 years ago. The massive fallout was incredibly swift, utterly brutal, and absolutely final. Richard immediately called his private security team to forcefully escort Chloe out of the massive estate with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. He completely froze all their accounts and unleashed ruthless lawyers to initiate a devastating emergency divorce. I proudly watched her get dragged away, feeling the heavy, suffocating chains of the past 15 years finally shatter completely. Richard was deeply grateful for my absolute honesty, heavily promoting my business to his billionaire friends and making me incredibly wealthy and successful. Within 6 months, my elite company was managing 12 of the most exclusive, expensive properties in the entire state, and Sarah was promoted to my general manager, finally giving us the peace we deserved. As I sit here today, looking out over the beautiful garden of the gorgeous home I finally bought with my own honest, hard-earned money, I realize that true justice always incredibly finds a way to balance the scales. I tragically lost my innocent youth to a cold concrete cell, but I gained an unshakable, immense power and resilience that absolutely no one can ever take away from me. I learned the hard way that you cannot set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm, even if they share your exact blood. Would you have sacrificed absolutely everything for a deeply toxic family member, or would you have walked away and let them face the brutal consequences of their own terrible actions? Think carefully about who you protect. Until the next story.